Yeah. Hey guys, all right, just before the show starts, I wanted to let you guys know that my fight against cancel culture is still happening. Please go to the description below. There's a link titled Support My Fight Against Cancel Culture. If you want to help my fight, please consider giving a bit of a donation. All the information's in that link. With that being said, enjoy the show.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the new show on Joe Emilio's channel called Let's Get Real with Dr. Dioné Harley. I'm Dioné Harley, and every fortnight I'll be having a guest on the show to talk about some interesting topics that people find it difficult to talk about. But hopefully, we can do that in a reasonable and enjoyable way without, slitting people's throats and calling them names. So I'm so happy to be here. I just want to say thank you to Joe Emilio for being willing to give me this opportunity to also bring people on who I would like to talk to and hopefully we all benefit from talking to. I thought as a starting point, this has been a question that I've been struggling with for quite a long time, and I haven't really been able to have any decent conversations with people about it. I tried once on Twitter, but as we all know, on Twitter it's a fool's errand to try and find any constructive conversation there because people inevitably just start calling people names and things. So my guest tonight is Phumlani Majozi, and he's a senior fellow at African Liberty. And the reason why I invited him onto the show is because he always tends to say very thought-provoking and, in my opinion, very intelligent things on Twitter that really resonate with me. And so he is someone who, as a writer, as a business analyst, he studies a lot of topics in economics and politics in South Africa in particular. So I thought he would be a perfect person to weigh in on our topic tonight, which is, does systemic racism exist in South Africa? Welcome, Phumlani.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Congrats on your show. I wish you all the best. I'm sure it will go well. Hopefully, you'll get Julius Malema to explain why he was attacking clicks today.
Right.
Click stores across the country. So hopefully your show will sort of get those guests in the future. But I look forward to the chat tonight. It's going to be a very interesting topic. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. So if you could just give us a bit of information on your background, your interests, where you come from, where you see yourself going.
Well, I do a number of things, but I'm quite well known in the media as a senior fellow at African Liberty, which is an organization advancing pro-market values and principles, the ideas of individual freedom, and it's based in the USA, but when it was formed, it was an idea that something must be done for Africa, right? So there are a group of guys based in Africa who are doing it. And so I'm one of those guys who are looking into focusing in Africa and trying to advance these ideas. It basically falls under Students for Liberty. So some people may know Students for Liberty, that began in the USA, a movement from campuses to advance individual freedom, and then spread across the world, including Africa as well. So there is African Liberty. I'm also affiliated with the Free Market Foundation, which I love very much. Has been around since 1975 and is doing great work in South Africa in terms of arguing to the public and to government that we need a limited government that will ensure that economic growth is front and center, that people are able to trade as they want, as long as they don't interfere in other people's businesses. We sort of we want to empower the poor, and that's what has been the focus. Of course, we don't say we want to empower the poor, but our main, in our heart, it's been the poor, right? Because they are the ones who have to move up the income ladder in South Africa. So I sit on the board of the Free Market Foundation. I do some youth stuff there. I also work in the investment banking world. So doing some sort of advising investors. So those are things that I do basically. I love being engaged on the issues, socio-economic, and that's why I'm so active on Twitter. That's why I'm in the media. That's why I write often, and and that's why I'm currently working on my first book as well. That I'm just recently found a publisher, and so I'm working on that. So I mean, we shall see how it goes. But those are my interests. Originally, I'm from KZN. I studied at Rhodes, Economics and Information Systems, my undergraduate studies there, and then moved to Cape Town for my honors degree, and studied there for 1 year, and then came back and worked here in Johannesburg. So I've been around here for a number of years now. So yeah, it's been an exciting journey that has basically is beginning in a way. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I think that it's very important to know so that everyone knows we actually do try and find people who know what they're talking about, not just any off the street. But just to let everyone know, so as we start the conversation, you're all welcome to, it's a live stream, so you're welcome to send through any comments or questions you may have. About 10 to 15 minutes before the show ends, we'll go into those questions, and Joe will also join us for that section of the show. I'll remind people later in the show in case anyone forgets, because we do want to hear what you guys have to say and what you're thinking about and what you're wondering about. So I thought that for this discussion, as a good starting point, as a typical philosopher's starting point, I think it's good for us to just get clear on some terminology. So I think the term systemic racism, I only encountered this term when I was doing my PhD in Canada. It was the first time that I encountered the term. So that was between 2013 and I finished in 2017. And I at the time, I didn't know what that was. I didn't understand how it was being distinguished from racism as we normally use the term. So I thought that as a starting point, we would just first look at how people generally tend to distinguish those two concepts. I don't know if you'd like to go first and give me your understanding of that, because I have my own understanding of how we distinguish those two concepts.
Well, I can give you what I sort of think what systematic racism is,
Okay.
and also what it's believed to be widely right now. I mean, what is it about? What does the public, at least in my view, what do they think it is, right?
Yes.
What the public think racism is, this is just the general public or systematic racism. When you look at what's been happening in the US, right, over the past months, around the issue of George Floyd, who died in a very bad way in the arms of a policeman, right? So ever since then, there has been all these protests that took place, right? Which led to riots, as we've been seeing over the past months. And what's been the Black Lives Matter movement, which originates in America, as that is well known. They have been sort of instrumental in these protests, which led to riots. And their argument since then, in fact, even before then, at least it's been sort of very much widely seen in the media since then, since the incident of George Floyd. The argument is that there are these sort of existing barriers, right? There is this existing sort of racism against Black people, right? When they say systematic racism, they mean racism against Black people. That's what, in my observation, when people speak of systematic racism, they mean Black oppression of some kind by a white system, or basically white people, right? So that's the general kind of explanation of what systematic racism is in the general public. Now, that's different from what I think systematic racism is. My view is systematic racism means having the laws that are put in place that stop people from progressing or from living their lives as they want on the basis of their race, right? So that's what I think systematic racism is. You've put in a system there intentionally by the bureaucrats, right, to stop the advancement of a specific racial group. That's what systematic racism is. Yeah. So those are two sort of explanations of what it is. Yes, continue.
Sorry. So apartheid would, for example, be quintessentially a form of systemic racism because it was as a system. There were laws that were actually put in place to oppress Black people in this country.
That's exactly my point. Yeah,
okay.
That's exactly my point. Yeah.
So the comment I just want to make about here, okay, so I will at certain points I will play devil's advocate. So it's not necessarily that I think these things, but I'm going to try and draw out what I think they think so that we actually address the points head on and don't try and deflect. So with the George Floyd example, so a good way of understanding the distinction for us tonight is to say that in the case of everyday racism, it's racism where you treat someone of another race, you discriminate against them based on the color of their skin. And that tends to be associated with a particular attitude or psychological state that you have developed in relation to someone else. So it's kind of beliefs you have towards them, it's behavior you enact, etc. And that's usually considered more direct. So if a white person attacked a Black person for no other reason than he thinks that he can just do that because he's a Black guy and thinks Black men don't deserve proper treatment. That would be a direct form of racism. Whereas with systemic racism, the idea is that it's not as individual based, it's more a community based, or it's more of a collective agency based phenomenon where it's less direct. So it's not that, as a white person, I just go up to a Black person and slap them because I think I can. There's some sort of mechanism that prevents me from having to be that direct, but nonetheless, it still harms that person. So in the case of George Floyd, one other way of saying that it is actually a systemic racism, so it is less direct than other forms of racism, is to say that, well, it's not that there's a law that says that Black people can be treated more aggressively than white people when they're apprehended by the police, but there are certain norms around that are enacted in police departments where that has been taken up as an okay way of behaving towards Black people. So if police officers are more violently handle Black suspects, it's not frowned upon, or they're not prevented from doing so, and that's a form of systemic racism because that's a norm that's accepted. So it's an indirect kind of harm because it's not like you're saying you can go and hit this person, but you're also not going to prevent it if it happens because that's a kind of norm that's come to be accepted. I know they're not going to say it in the way I've said it, but I can take it that that's a way in which they can construe violence against Black men in the States as a form of systemic racism. That in police departments, it's become acceptable for policemen to treat them more violently than they would white people that are suspects. What would you say to something like that?
Well, it's not only the issue of police. Just to add before I answer your question, there are people who also, I see this on the social media, who will say, well, just because white people are making more income than blacks, therefore it's systemic racism. Right.
Yeah.
We're sort of talking about wealth inequality. Let me put it like that. Therefore, it's a systematic racism. On the issue of the police in America, I'm not an American, right? I've been to America once, which was last year, for different reasons, not related to the subject we are talking about now. But I have sort of watched it closely and see different arguments that come from America, right? And the different arguments that come from around the world as well. So I have a view about it as someone who's sort of far away. Yes, there is violence taking place of police against civilians in America, right? And the most interesting thing is that what people overlook when it comes to that subject specifically, police versus civilians, people, they forget to look at the whole context and to look at what does the data look like, right? When you look at the past, I think Larry Elder is an American radio talk show host. He talks about this often. When he says that, yes, that violence is there to an extent, but it's been declining significantly over the past years, right? And it's been declining even faster towards blacks, right? When you look at the number of deadly encounters between the police in America and blacks, the number of people who lose their lives, the number of black people who lose their lives is very much lower than whites, right? So the argument is that the police are holding back the most victims from the police in terms of losing their lives. It's not actually black people, right? It's white people, right? Now, some would say, well, white people account for the majority of, they are the biggest number in America. But even then, when you look at it, even when you look at it from a proportional point of view, still though, I mean, and the moment you look at, and you can't look at how the police, you can't look only at how the police respond to crime without looking at the proportional kind of criminality from the offenders, right? From those who offend. When you look into that, you find that actually crime in the black community in the US, it is more at a staggering rate, right? Apparently, plus minus 50% of homicides are committed by blacks, against black people, right? And the numbers are quite staggering from that view. So I mean, it's important to have. My view is that discussion of police in America versus civilians, you cannot take it, you cannot divorce it from the levels of crime, right? You can't. You can't divorce it from the levels of crime, because if there is more criminality in black sort of communities, therefore the police would be called there almost often, and because of how dangerous the place is, it's going to be more risky, right? But even though that is the case, it's still, I mean, the numbers apparently do show that the police still hold back, right, relative to how they behave towards in terms of violence and taking lives towards whites. So I mean, we need context into this. But one point to make here: the reason why the George Floyd thing made so much headlines is because it was a white person. George Floyd is a black person and died in the hands of a white person. Whenever, and this is the case even in South Africa, whenever a white person, for some reasons, which could be by mistake or by intention, right, takes a black human life, I'm telling you, it's going to make big headlines in the media, and it will be associated with racism. Right. So whenever, I don't understand how our human society works, because whenever a white person does something bad to a black person, it's just taken as something else. Hey, and it becomes so huge, as if, whereas when you look at since George Floyd passed away, the number of killings that have happened between blacks, right, it's shocking in America, right? This is even true. What I notice is that the dynamics are even true in South Africa. South Africa, just show a video of one stupid white person doing something racist to a black person. You will see the buzz in the media. You will see politicians making statements, celebrities, jumping in. And then the 58 murders per day, people who are killed every day. And that's largely black on black crime. It's never spoken about. South Africa accounts for, I think it's in the top 6 homicide rates globally, right? I mean, it's staggering how people are killing each other in South Africa, but that's not spoken about.
So in a country like South Africa, where the majority of people are black, it gives us a very different picture to the one in the States. And in particular, I just want to focus on what you just said. So the fact that the news gets spread the way that it does. So yes, the government has some control over what gets attention. But people in this country also share news, share comments, share things on social media. Why do you think it has such an impact still in this country, where people seem so willing to share the accounts of when it's white on black crime, and still have such a reaction to it when they know for a fact that if the tables were turned, no one would care about that kind of, even if it was black on black crime, no one would care. Why do people in this country still feel the need to blow it out of proportion to that extent? Where do you think that reaction comes from?
That's a very tough question. And my view is that you can't divorce it from our history as well, of where we come from, of how, the white minority are seen in South Africa. You also can't divorce it from, I would say, the lack of information and knowledge and education, right? Because it has taken me a while to have this kind of a stance on these issues where I am. You've got to be well read to take the stance where I am right now as a black person, right? You've got to understand as to, what does the data tell you and what does economics tell you. I mean, you look at things objectively, right? I can tell you that even people with, as kind of a middle class as I am, and, they don't have the stance that I have, many of them. In fact, I would say the majority, right? They are in the sort of the group that you've just spoken about, people who sort of share things and blow it out of proportion and so on. If it's white person who did something to a black person. So, I mean, there is politics as well. When you look at what the EFF, Julius Malema's EFF, when you look at what they are good at, is to stoke racial tensions, right? If there's a racial issue, they suddenly jump in, they become, the crusaders against so-called racists. They do what they did today, destabilizing cliques, and apparently some of the cliques branches were petrol bombed. So, I mean, politics as well, in the sense that in South Africa, politicians raise cut and tying that to politics, they use that a lot, right? Yeah. Don't vote for a party that has mostly or is widely supported by white people because they're going to bring back apartheid, right? That's called scaremongering, right? You scare people with apartheid. These people will oppress you, right? So, I mean, those are the kind of, there's history, there's so much, there's politics involved, there's misinformation, I mentioned earlier. There is also lack of knowledge, of understanding of politics and history. You've really got to be well read to be in a position where I am, where I have to defend myself every day to say that I'm not bought by white people, right? I'm not a sellout. I'm pointing to issues that are important, that have to move the country forward, that will make all of us a better country.
Okay, so let's go to South Africa and South African context now. So I was thinking we could go through, so if we look at the topic of systemic racism in this country and we split it between the public and the private sector, we can maybe go through a list of things that we've heard that have been mentioned to be instances of systemic racism and see if we can decide on whether we agree that those things are. So for one thing, one systemic problem that was brought up, and this would be specific to the private sector that I mentioned when I first spoke to Joe the first time I was interviewed, was that someone on Twitter told me that black people still get paid less than white people, even though they have the same amount of experience and the same qualifications for a specific job. And I remember someone responded and said, no, that's not true. But I don't know, have you come across any data to show that that's the case?
No, there's no data that shows that. So I cannot come on your show here with the public watching and claim that. So I've heard people saying that, right? But there's no data. I'm trying to say there's no study that proves that.
So there's no study been done to this effect.
There's nothing I have seen. There's nothing I have seen at all. Yeah.
I struggled to find. I was looking for a study on this, and I also couldn't find anything. And I thought that was weird because that seems to be. So from my point of view, if you're going to point to something as a feature of a system that is in some sense discriminatory, then there have to be objective data points that we can look at and say, okay, but we can see here that there's some sort of trend so that we can track and say, yes, there's something going on here. And I would have thought that if this was even a discussion point, that the government or someone would have taken the initiative to check what is happening with salaries in the private sector.
You see, just to add here, it's a general kind of sort of something I hear as we've just heard. There's never, as you've just said right now, if this be proven from a study research point of view, there must have already been some sort of government looking into the matter and saying that we are taking steps to address this, right? So, I mean, there hasn't been a study that has been done, so I cannot come and, sort of support something that doesn't have on a public platform. That hasn't really been there's no evidence that lies out there, sort of official evidence that is there from a research point of view. Yeah.
And another one that I was thinking of more recently, I was thinking about the geographical layout of cities, and so because of apartheid, the way in the areas where Black people are commonly found and situated, and Indian people because of the apartheid legacy, could we say that in that sense that's a form of systemic racism? It's more of the legacy, but in the sense that their access to the economy is different because of where they are physically situated, so where their homes are, the distances that people have to travel, and all those kinds of things. Has there been a study done on this question, how much that has affected and access to the economy?
You see, it's very important to understand what period are we talking about, right? Are we talking about a period before 1994 or after 1994? Right. Before 1994, we all do agree there was systematic racism, right? There were laws against Black people. That's before 1994. And then there is after 1994. The question is, are there laws, right, after 1994? Laws passed by government, by the way, that sort of repress a specific group of people on the basis of their race. Now, I'm going to speak the truth here because we have to tell the truth as it is. Your show is Get Real, right? That's the name of the show. So let's get real. When you look at Black economic empowerment, the aim is to white people are finding it difficult to participate in our economy. As a result, many of them are packing their bags and leaving the country, right, with their skills. Yeah. When you look at how the ANC behaved during COVID-19, when it comes to relief and so on, suddenly now they bring all this racial kind of classification as to who should receive the relief and so on when it comes to businesses, right, by race, right? So if you speak of does systematic racism exist in South Africa? Well, if you are saying against, yes, it does, but that should be against white people, to speak the truth, because there are those laws. And that's, by the way, according to my definition I gave you earlier, that I'm speaking about laws here. Yeah. So in that perspective, it does exist in the sense that white people are finding it hard to sort of, participate in the economy. But now people will counter this and say to me, well, when you look at the management in the private sector as reported by Department of Labor, about 68 to close to 70% of the management is still white. When you look at especially management, when you look at also the levels of levels of education, whites remain they're more skilled than blacks. This is according to Statistics South Africa, not just my own making. And people will say, well, then what do you mean white people can't, participate productively? But we need to understand again what is our point. Well, if we start at 1994, we should look at our starting point. And at that starting point, Black people were left behind, right? And whites were already, right, ahead, right? And we are just 25 years out of that, out of that year. And things are going to take time to change, right? So now it means that the people who were already at the time doing well from a sort of amongst whites, they're still doing okay, and they were the majority still then. As a result, they still remain. But the people who are trying to start things out, in many cases in South Africa, white people, they struggle, right? Or they are trying to start something new, or perhaps maybe they left one career and starting another. It could be or they, especially government assistance as well. If they things like relief that we've spoken about. So they kind of struggle to get those. But that doesn't mean that they are not ahead. They are ahead, no doubt, in terms of income, in terms of ownership, in terms of top management, as I've just mentioned earlier, in the private sector. But that also is because of where we come from. But the moment they start, when things change for them in some way, somehow, COVID-19 comes and it destabilizes their businesses, and they look for relief. Now they will struggle to find things like that because of their race. So it is a complex kind of topic that one has to tackle quite carefully, and you should get it right. And it can't be perfect, but you should lay out the facts and see exactly where we are. The main thing that we need to think about as South Africans is how much progress, especially when we measure Black progress since 1994. We shouldn't compare it to how much our incomes sort of align or are the same with whites. We should compare it, we should rather ask ourselves how much progress have Black people made since 1994 in terms of education, in terms of rising to the middle class, in terms of many other measurements. And when you look at that, there has been a lot of progress along the way, despite governments, in some occasions, governments bad policies.
Let's just pause there to tell everyone, if you just join the conversation, please leave your comments and your questions. We will get to them towards the end of the show. We just want to get through the bulk of the conversation, and then we'll address any questions you may have. And just to say to you, Phumlani, I completely agree, because whenever people start then backtracking it to pre-94, I also tend to say to them, but what conversation are we having? Are we talking about the legacy of apartheid that's still having an impact on us now? Which of course it is. There's no way we can magically make up for that. In which case, that's not systemic racism now. What we were talking about was systemic racism in the now, not the legacy of what systemic racism in the past had done. So I completely agree with you. If we're going to look at where we're at, we need to keep it within the framework of post-94. And also, to say, they tend to point to inequality. So this is a common response I've received, is they point to inequalities and they say because of the inequality there must be systemic racism, and that's just not true. There can be a lot of there can be disparities between groups, and it doesn't mean that there is necessarily a form of discrimination going on.
You see, people who say that, who make those arguments, are people who have zero understanding of economics, right? And people who are not sort of objective and rational when it comes to things. Just because you make a higher income than me doesn't mean that there is some sort of a system that is in place right now that is stopping me from making as high as your income. Or maybe I'm making more income and you are making less. It doesn't mean that there is some a formal system that is in place that makes sure that result takes place, that I make more, that you make less. The reason why we need to understand that people's incomes have never been the same at any point in human history, because people have different skills. People are interested in different things, right? If I'm going to go into a specific field like perhaps chartered accountancy and study rise up and join one of these big corporates, and you go into maybe saying, I don't know, the nursing sort of work, or perhaps teaching grade 1 kids, that field, the fields don't pay the same, right? Because the production skills required to work on those things they are different. As a result, they are valued differently, right? So now, if you're in that sector and I'm in this sector that I'm in, we earn different salaries. That doesn't say, oh, we have different incomes, which could result to different wealth. It does not mean that there is, a system that is sort of there against you because you are making less income. Could be because of your job, because of many other things. And by the way, because also of the apartheid legacy, right? But that doesn't say there is racism now. That's why the starting point is very important. What are we talking about here? Are we saying there were rules and regulations that were holding people before 1994? Or are we saying that there are rules and whatever that are holding people now? And the data show that after 1994, when you look at the graduation rates, university access, the rise of blacks to middle class, overtaking that of whites, there has been in many ways progress, right? When you speak of black people sort of rising up. And that alone proves to you that there isn't sort of a systems or whatever that is sort of holding them back.
But people then get angry with me and they say, well, and they are black because they tell me they're black. It's not an assumption I'm making. They tell me this. That they say, well, it's because you're not black and you're not experiencing it. So are you saying that black people's experiences don't count? And I'm like, I'm not saying anything of the sort. I'm saying that your experiences don't necessarily mean that one thing is going on. It might be something else. So your experiences, if your experiences are telling you that there's something like systemic racism, then I would say it's not systemic racism, then it would be racism. Because if it's direct enough for you to experience it as racism, then it must be something that's very direct. So something like a microaggression now where someone says, asks you about your accent. So because overseas, that's a microaggression.
Yes.
The systemic nature of it must mean that it's something that is not directly harming you. It's in your environment and it's eventually harming you. But I don't know what they I don't know if you can explain to me, but I don't know what they mean.
By the way, one thing to mention, I'm not denying that there is no racism, right?
Yes.
Some people are racist out there, right?
Yes,
and
I never find that. And
exactly.
Make it clear. Well, but then when you say you're experiencing systemic racism, but then you're saying there's something in the system that is causing this experience because that's the reason you're having it. And I'm asking you, what is it that's causing it? But you can't point to anything because then they'll speak to, again, the inequalities. Well, there are disparities in society. But I'm like, but that doesn't mean if the cause of that is systemic racism. The cause of that could be many other things.
Many other things, including crime, including bad education. When you look at the levels of education in South Africa, there could be many factors. Corruption to an extent by government. There could be many factors that contribute to that. You can't. I think the people who are pushing for this systematic racism in this day and age, it's not only that they have politics, right? It's also the misinformation, right? If you are saying inequality of wealth means that there is systematic racism, it means we have no clue of how economics works. Even the basics of it, that if you have higher skills, you are going to earn more. And by the way, the moment you start comparing, the moment you start comparing apples and apples or oranges and oranges, in other words, comparing things exactly as they are, right? You have same skills, same number of experience, number of years of experience. You have as you compare, you may find out in some cases, in many cases, you find out that as a black person, I make more income than you as a white person, right? Because then you started to compare. Because it doesn't help to say, let me compare one black person to another white person. And these two people have different kinds of levels of education, different kinds of experiences, different expertise and so on. You can't do that. It's just a useless exercise that gets you nowhere.
So I'll use another example so that I can speak with an authority because it's my area. But as a woman in philosophy, the philosophy departments are often criticized heavily because they're dominated by men, also because they're dominated by white men. And a lot of women take issue with this and are very quick to read into everything that women are being put down, or women are in certain ways subtly and not so subtly being excluded from the departments and the way they operate. So they call on interventions and other people to come in and facilitate, to try and change how we operate in our departments, because it's not inclusive enough of women. Now, I've been in 3 philosophy departments in 3 different continents, and I can tell you, I've never experienced discrimination. I've never felt that a man in the philosophy department has treated me as less than because I'm a woman. And again, it's not because I'm saying sexist acts don't take place. It's not because I'm saying that men haven't behaved inappropriately in a professional environment, or that they've treated women in a sexist way. But I'm saying it's not a systematic problem, and as in it's not built into the norms and the functioning of a philosophy department that they treat women that way. But again, if I say that, there are a lot of women and people in my field, well, before I left it, who would get very upset with me because they're saying that I'm basically ignoring all the evidence. But all the evidence is, once again, there's nothing they can point to. They just keep mentioning these experiences that people have. And often when I hear what the experience amounts to, I disagree as to whether that is sexist behavior. I'm like, but what if the person is just
questionable? Yeah, I mean, it becomes a questionable thing. Is it?
I said to the one woman, I said to her, but this is one professor that everyone thought was sexist, and I had never experienced that with him. And I said, but he treats everyone like that. It's not specific to women. He's just like that to everyone. It's not illegal to be an asshole. You can't tell people they can't be a dick anymore. Like that, you should just ignore the person. But the fact it's not taken, for me, again, the issue is that we talk about in feminism, we talk about empowerment, and at various in lots of marginalized groups, there's talk of empowerment. And to me, empowerment is not saying, here's a problem, I need another entity or another something to come and sort it out for me because I can't, sort it out myself. So
Yeah.
In my case, it's like they want another department or university structure to come in and tell them they must now change how they do things. And it's like, if I feel a man is treating me inappropriately, then I will tell him, just say to him, don't do that.
Report that, yeah.
Exactly, report it, but make sure I deal with it.
Yes, and the fact that there's underrepresentation of women in your field doesn't tell us there's systematic racism against women in your field. It doesn't tell us that. The fact that you are the only woman in your field to take the extreme case doesn't say to us, well, clearly there are some rules and practices or whatever formalized and aimed at blocking women into entering the philosophy field. It doesn't. What this tells you, because just to give you experience, as you and I are speaking about philosophy right now, I've never, ever thought, even when I was at high school, of something called philosophy, right? Of that field, of philosophy. I never thought of that, right? Now, it could be that I was from a township, that I'm from a township, right? And went to a school not too far away from the township. And therefore, perhaps because of the environment, there was this sort of limited knowledge of what could one do after school. There's always this thing of a lawyer, a doctor, a chartered accountant, and I mean, an IT person or whatever. So, I mean, there are all these sort of a journalist. So all these fields, they're sort of well known. It could be because of that. But I mean, even when I was at university as well, I never developed that interest. I went to university to do commerce, and I liked that, and I stick to that, right? Now, there are many people like me. Perhaps most Black people from townships are just like me, right? In terms of knowing very little, and by the way, not only knowing very little on philosophy, but also not having an interest in philosophy, right? Yeah. So if you're in a situation where it turns out that really very few ladies are interested in philosophy and more men are, so then what's wrong?
And it's true because the numbers show, the studies show that generally men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. So they're more likely to study people-orientated subjects like walking and
Subject, yeah.
men are more interested in ideas and everything like that. So and it's not to say that there aren't, like there are women in philosophy, I'm in philosophy, there are women. It's not that you don't have people who deviate from that, but generally, yes, men are more interested in a certain set of things and women are more interested, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is an interest that you either develop or you don't develop it.
Yeah. So now to spend more time thinking, how do we get more women into philosophy field? What can we do now? Stressing ourselves.
I don't know why, because it's not, because I wouldn't say yes, this mantra of diversity is also, it's becoming a obsessive tendency, and I have yet to have someone explain to me, because they're not talking about diversity of thought. They're talking about diversity in terms of ethnicities. So
with the naked eye, basically.
Yes.
That's the diversity they are talking about.
And I still don't know what they think that contributes to anything. What is the inherent value of diversity in and of itself? Because they've also shown that there is actually not that much diversity. Even if you have a group of people who are ethnically diverse, it doesn't mean you're going to have diversity of thought. And if anything, what the academy, the strength of an academy is when it has diversity of thought. And when I was in the academy, I just saw diversity of thought dying every single day, because more and more people were being taught to think alike in every way, and a whole set of ideas were starting to be seen as taboo and problematic and all of these things. And for me, that's a bigger thing to worry about, rather than trying to push women into a field that they don't seem to have an interest in being. How do we again bring back the diversity of thought that allows us to progress in society? But this is not such a concern. Again, it's just how things look on the outside. It's just, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's what people like Thomas Sowell, he's an American economist. He has been sort of very much vocal over decades on that. There's another lady, I don't know if I pronounce her name right, it's Heather McDonald, who studies the police in the US. In fact, she's the one who's written books sort of arguing the mainly conservative perspective on police in America, that it's because of black crime, that there is sort of, in other words, she says that the biggest problem is black crime, not the police shootings and so on. So that's her main kind of work she does. But those people have been vocal over years, this idea of diversity, right? And for them, it doesn't help to put different sort of genders, or race in one room, or at least aim to have different races in one room. But in fact, what you get is just one kind of thinking that adds no value, right? Rather look for diversity of thought and say, what are these people? What I've learned over the years, and what I'm sort of more interested in now. I'm interested in ideas than race. That's where I am right now. I'm not interested in your race. I'm interested in your ideas, right? Yeah. For me, I think that's very important. Was there's no difference between someone who comes from Soweto, the township here in Gauteng, and is a radical communist, right? And somebody, this is a black person from Soweto. He's a radical communist, right? And a white person coming from Sentin, and is also a radical communist. For me, those people, they are not adding any value, right? I don't see any kind of I'm interested, and I'm not going to like them both because of their ideas, right? Yeah. I'm not going to say, well, I like the guy in Soweto because he's black. I don't like his ideas. I don't like the white guy in Sentin with his communist ideas. I don't like the guy in Soweto with his communist ideas. It's ideas that are driving me, right? It's not the race thing. And I was listening to Moile Zimbegi today, and he's one of the famous South African writers and somebody who has contributed a lot in this country. And he was saying, this race thing, race thing, black, white, or whatever in South Africa, it's wasting our time, right? We are not resolving the problems of fatherlessness, right? The problems of crime, the problems of ANC's bad policies, the ruling party, corruption, right? Poverty. These are issues that we are facing that we should, focus on as a nation. Then talking about is she white, is she black? I mean, whatever, and then all these racial kind of discussions, they are not really helpful at all.
Thanks. So let's just turn to the audience for a moment. Let's just see if people have any questions or comments they'd like to say. Joe, if you would just enlighten us, please.
No problem. Hi, guys. Great conversation, by the way. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. All right, so we have a few comments, yes. I'll start from the bottom, work my way up. Nati has joined us saying hello. Dodgy Idealist had to leave, but he said it was a great chat. He enjoyed the chat very much. And he agreed with a lot of what you guys had to say. Charles Russo says, nobody has ever complained that the majority of basketball players are black. He's just commenting that. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I can add something to that. You see, the thing is, again, it comes back to this misinformation and misunderstanding on how things work. Because wherever the majority is black people, no one complains about that, right? Whether in South Africa or even in the West. So, I mean, there is not much complaints if the majority represented in a basketball team or whatever are largely blacks, But the moment it's largely white people, suddenly now it's a problem. Where do we find now a white woman, or where do we find? Where do we find a black woman? Where do we find a black man? Because if it's mainly white, it's a problem. Who said that? Why do we see things like that? There's so much that one doesn't understand. I think this thing has to do with the psychology of how people see things. I don't know. Dion, you are the philosopher. Maybe you have a different kind of perspective. But to me, it doesn't make it's something that really intrigues me, honestly speaking. Yeah.
Well, the one thing I wanted to say, one of the things I mentioned in the previous talk is, which I think Jordan Peterson hit on the head, was the fact that we are creatures that search for meaning. So the fact that in a lot of respects in the West, so many symbols or frameworks of meaning have started to die, that it was a right time for communism and socialism, for a lot of the views that form part of that movement, so part of the social justice warrior movement, to step in and say, we can give you a cause that can make you feel morally righteous, can make you feel like your life has meaning. And this entire framework comes with a whole set of concepts and a whole language that you need to be part of, and you need to be. It's literally like a new Christianity, where it's this entire new book of words you need to know and understand, and you need to know how they fit together, so that you can be one of the chosen ones to go and fight all these evils in the world. And I know for me it resonates a lot, because when I see how these people behave in terms of how they express their disapproval, it comes across as a form of fanaticism. It does have that sense about it. And so for me, it does seem to them, they think that this is now giving their life meaning. And that's why they're so self-righteous all the time, and not willing to in any way entertain the idea that they might be wrong about some of it, because then all of it's going to come caving down, and they're back in a nihilistic framework which they don't know what to do with. They don't know how to dig themselves out of it.
Yeah. And just something to add, as we speak about sport, so much talk in South Africa about having black representation in our rugby national team, right? Now, again, as a black person from South Africa, my sort of experience is that black people in large part are not interested in rugby, right? And I mean, if that is the case, where I come from, even schools where I come from, and there are many areas like mine, there was no focus at all on rugby. right? So if there is no interest in schools, and there is no interest among blacks for rugby, I mean, it's hard for you to be. Yes, of course, there is a legacy in South Africa that we have, but my point is that there are other factors as well we need to think about when it comes to, if we are going to seek to push that we should have more black players, and be stressed now as to, in the next World Cup, how are we going to have sort of a diversified sort of team that's diversified by race, right?
Mm.
I mean, so there are many factors that contribute to these things, and to an extent, it also comes back to what we've mentioned earlier during the show, and that is different interests as well. It's not only that we spoke about gender earlier, that women could be interested in something that has to do with people, and men are more interested in things that have, in doing things, right? Those differences could also be there even amongst racial groups. It's possible, right? That mainly whites, they like this, mainly blacks, they like this.
I was reading an article where it was talking about how research regarding any traits that are intrinsic to, because of different racial categories, all that research was shut down because of the political backlash when anyone trying to in any way suggest that there might be such differences because of racial or ethnicity. Any value we could gain from that knowledge. If there are these intrinsic differences that are not IQ related or but whatever, we won't know what those differences are because you're not allowed to do that research anymore because of its political dimensions. Because
and vilified and
Yes, and so now I was saying to Joe, this is what makes me upset about the trans movement, is that the moment it reaches a point where your ideology blocks my research so that I can actually learn something that I might need to know to make the world a better place, that for me is where your ideology really harms me. And that's where I will put my foot down, because I don't see why the world should suffer for those reasons.
But, I mean, the fact is, to be honest, you and I will be in the minority. You and I already right now are in the minority, right? There is this sweeping kind of, I don't know, what can I call it, belief, this where diversity is the push, not only in the Western world, in South Africa as well, without looking into what could be other factors that are determining the state of our society, right? So even the issue of fatherlessness, the statistics released a few years back by Stats South Africa show that about 60% of kids in South Africa are in households without their fathers, right? Now, in that 60%, a big chunk, the biggest chunk, is the Black community, right? My community, where I come from, right? So, I mean, a child who comes from a family that has two parents, a household headed by two parents, that's a big benefit in life. It's a massive benefit, and people overlook that. And the child who doesn't have a father, and research has shown, though I haven't seen research specifically in South Africa, but research around the world has shown that kids who grow up without their fathers, boys tend to lean more towards crime. Girls could get pregnant, teenage pregnancy, and so on. There's so much they get wrong in life because of the absence of fathers. Now the left now pushes back. They're saying, well, there are women who are very good at raising why are you being a misogynist? Why are you being discriminating against women? There are many women out there who raise kids as single parents. Yes, they are, and we should acknowledge for many reasons that they are brave and they are doing a good job. But it doesn't change the dynamics that a child with two parents, growing up with two parents, has a huge advantage. In fact, more advantage than that parent, than the one born growing up with a single parent. And on net balance, the kids with their moms and dads, they are sort of much ahead.
I just quickly want to ask a question that someone sent me through last week. So they were just wondering, because you were talking about your involvement in investment banking. So he was asking about in the banking and insurance industries, is there anything that you've seen or can think of that would constitute systemic racism? So any policies or any procedures that you've encountered that in any way discriminate? His point was that the only space where he can see where there's any room for systemic racism to even become an option is in the private sector.
Well, now there was a report last year. There were allegations, right, that were made by someone, and that person was publicly fighting First National Bank, right, the bank that we all know in South Africa. And that person was saying the bank was charging sort of higher interest for its black clients, right? And that issue was in the media, right? To an extent that even today, some people are saying that, well, FNB, to prove that if you don't believe that there's systematic racism or there's racism against blacks by corporates and so on, well, just look at what FNB did. They charged high interest for black clients. That issue even went to court, right? And the court threw it out. They said no. The facts we see, it wasn't because of race. There are credit records that determine whether you should, get the loan or not, and what should be the interest rate, right? Here in South Africa, that's what the court said. The court said that there is no proof that there are any sort of racially motivated practices with respect to what FNB was doing. But still, even though that's the case, there are people who are still advancing that narrative that FNB was there charging black people higher interest rates, of which that has never been the case. Last time I checked. So it's your credit record, could be anything else that determine. Now, here's what's going to happen. You'll find that there is an overrepresentation of black people in people with bad credit records. That could be the case, right? Or there could be an overrepresentation of Indians in the list of people with bad credit records. It happens. Or it could be whites, right? So the moment the result comes out and say, well, most people here in this list who have bad credit records, well, when you look at them by race, it's mostly black. Therefore, we'll charge a high interest rate. Well, not that therefore because of, but I mean, if you have a bad credit record, we'll have to charge you a high interest rate, right? Now, because most of those people are black, therefore, it will be construed or seen as racism, which is wrong again, right? So, I mean, there's so much that's wrong. And to me, it comes back to be at a position where you and I are talking like this on these issues and bringing up all these alternative, or not alternative, but different factors that could shape our society, right? That are overlooked. And rather things, instead, they look at things as they see color, right? Without looking at other factors that you and I have been discussing. I mean, most people, they don't do what you and I are doing. As a result, they look at things in terms of race, and they miss a lot that we should be talking about.
Talking about diversity, I mean, like so much of what we were saying throughout the conversation comes back to education, comes back to helping people think differently about things, because a lot of the reason why they think in a very one-dimensional way is because they haven't been educated, their worlds haven't been opened up so that they can actually start understanding how all these different factors can have an impact. As a final point, as we draw the show to a close, I just want to ask you something. So given that you're involved in all these organizations that fight for individual rights and fight for free markets and fight to spread these ideas and to try and help people look at these things from a different perspective, how do you feel, what do you think the impact is that these organizations are having across the continent? Do you think that they are gaining some headway, or do you think that the way in which they're going about it may not be the most effective way of doing it? What are your thoughts on our ability so people who share these ideas, our ability to spread them and to help people think more about these things?
Well, for South Africa, the ability is there. But for other African countries, I think the movement is not as advanced and strong as South Africa's, right? Partly because of other African countries have a much lower standards of living, right? Yeah. So I guess that contributes as well. So the strongest movement in sub-Saharan Africa, the strongest movement, the strongest pro-market movement, right, is in South Africa, right? You can't find any strongest in other countries, in other countries in Africa. But there are guys, friends who in Kenya who are doing the same work, but they're not as strong as us, of course, in their country. There are other guys I know in Nigeria as well. I've been in both countries who are doing some work. There's other guys I know in Uganda, Burundi as well, who are doing some work. In the African continent, across, whether here in South Africa, it's been tough, no doubt. Advancing free markets has been one of the things that you really need to be strong to advance, to push, for many reasons. In South Africa, it's mainly about race, right? If you push pro-market ideas, if you are white, you don't care about the apartheid legacy. You want to make sure that the white people remain sort of richer than blacks. If you are black, you are a sellout. You are a house Negro. You are being paid by white people. So there's a resistance in South Africa based on that. Are we winning as the movement in South Africa? When you look at how our government, we are struggling to win. To be honest with you, we are not doing well in my view, because as long as people vote for the parties that enter our ideas, right? Yeah. As long as the parties that are not pro market, right? As long as not pro business, as long as those parties are doing well, then parties that tells you that we haven't really gotten out the message there. Because if you've gotten the message out there, then when a person goes to the polling station during the election, it must show where they put their cross, right? Yeah. They go there with ideas as to, okay, this thing hasn't worked. I've seen this thing doesn't work. Business is better in terms of creating jobs and ending poverty. So let me cross next to a party that promotes that, right? So when you look at of how things are flowing in South Africa from a political point of view, it tells you that we haven't been able to convince, right? And when you look at how government doesn't, of course, listen to us, it's the ANC. It's just doing things that are bad all the way. So I wouldn't say we are winning there. We've been losing it there. We can't convince them. But the main thing, since these politicians are elected into power, the main thing we would win if we can convince the ordinary South Africans to do not vote them or vote them out in favor of people who promote our ideas, right? When Ronald Reagan won the election in 1980, when we won it for the first term, if I'm not mistaken, in America, there was so much talk of how Milton Friedman, the free market economist, was influential in shaping the public opinion, right? Now, that was a win for free market guys at that time, or at least in that year or so. So even Thomas Sowell once said he thinks that Ronald Reagan's win in his first term when he became the US president, it very much had to do with Milton Friedman's ideas that has sort of sharpened the society on how people see things. So if we could get there as a movement in South Africa, be able to shape the public opinion, that will lead towards people making, a better decision in terms of who they put into power.
Wow. Well, I think that's a great note to end the show on. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a great conversation. Thank you, Joe, also for hosting us. And thank you to everyone for watching. Please join us every fortnight, although I think Joe and I will be speaking to each other in the interim as well. But every fortnight I'll be having my own set of discussions. And let me know if there's some specific person you'd like me to have on the show as a guest. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Hey guys, so if you enjoyed the show, please consider giving it a like and a share. Don't forget to subscribe as well if you're new to my channel. And if you really enjoyed the content, feel free to join and become a member. Don't forget about my fight against cancel culture. That's in the link in the description below. Support my fight against cancel culture. Go to that link and all the information is there. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching.